Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kauschi. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in business and future affairs, market watch, industries, analysis and insights. We've got you covered right here on Niaga Spotlight. Well, today we're going on future affairs into a very interesting and timely topic indeed, which is the cradle-to-grave care economy and investments for national development. It's absolutely timely that we're talking about this because the care economy, in fact, has great economic growth potential for Malaysia. So, to frame this in a brief nutshell before we begin, firstly, the burden for unpaid care work, or UCW, as with all societies, falls primarily on women. Now, this includes childcare, household work, elderly care, as well as convalescent care. Now, these care constraints typically actually prevent women's labor force participation. And in Malaysia, there is a staggering almost 30% differential between women and men's LFPR. So, one strategy, of course, to address this, also keeping cognizant of the fact that Malaysia is both having a fall in fertility rates as well as being an aging society, is to invest in cradle-to-grave care economy. To discuss this in greater depth, I have the absolute pleasure of having in the studios with me live now Lee Min Hui, who is Senior Analyst for Social Policy and National Integration with think tank ISIS, together with her colleague Calvin Cheng, who is Fellow with the Economics, Trade and Regional Integration for ISIS as well. Thank you so much for making time. How are the both of you doing today?
Great, thank you for having us.
Fantastic. All right, so Min Hui, perhaps I could get started off by you helping us to actually frame the fact that unpaid care is increasingly being known globally in both the policy as well as the economic world as unpaid care work, or UCW. Of course, the term has been around for decades, but there's a lot more attention being paid to it, particularly due to some of the gaps that were exposed during the recent pandemic and associated lockdowns. Tell me more.
You're right in the sense that the pandemic was a really big turning point for care. A lot of people talked about how it was a care crisis, especially as all formal care services and centers were closed and the burden just fell on women in the family to take up all of that work. So countries need to recognize care because it is not sustainable to rely only on informal caregivers, the majority of whom are women who often receive little to no support beyond their community. So the expected number of people aged 65 and older is expected to double over the next 3 decades to about maybe 1.6 billion in 2050. And Asia is at the forefront of those demographic changes. So what that means is that unpaid care work and care needs are going to increase, but we do not necessarily have the services and infrastructure in place to cater to that need. So this is just something that is particularly urgent, but the time is now to start acting on that.
The time really is now, and I think there is always, though, a gap between recognition that often comes with civil society echoing what the policy world is saying, but then actually the difficulty of then translating it into recommendations. So tell me a little bit more about ISIS's recently launched Cradle-to-Grave Care Economy policy paper. What I was really interested in was the framing of it. Care economy, we've heard that term being bandied around a whole lot since late 2022 in Malaysia, but cradle to grave, why that, Min Hui?
Well, where we stand currently, we've looked at childcare and elderly care and disabled care all as separate domains.
Right.
And well, that's fine because they all have varying needs and circumstances.
Sure.
But the point is that a lot of this has relied on informal care, and because of that, we've also not been able to address it in a holistic way. This cradle-to-grave care economy is us trying to push forth a life cycle approach, understanding that care needs and risks are it lasts a person's lifetime. When we look at childcare, usually they separate it to 0 to 3 years old, 4 to 6 years old. But the reality is children require care well into adolescence. When you're in working age, you're going to have someone to rely on to be able, you probably have to care for your parents, a child, or you have someone to rely on to do that for you. Of course, when you're elderly, you're going to need that care, depending on the intensity of your care needs. But the idea of a cradle-to-grave care economy is to understand understand that care services and infrastructure need to respond to people's people's needs across the lifetime.
Right.
And that is a more inclusive way of doing it. So this is what we were trying to push for in our policy paper.
Yes, excellent. And I was particularly appreciative because essentially unpaid care work, which is performed largely by women, is not only undervalued, but it's also unaccounted for when it comes to typical economic proxies like GDP and etc. So going a little bit further into labor informality, Calvin, tell me a little bit more about the fact that some of the findings from your policy paper are actually pointing towards GDP numbers. Tell me about those numbers and also what were some of the parameters that you and the team were looking at to calculate them.
Thank you, Kamina. So I think where we started from was that from a baseline of like work is work. So domestic work is work and market work is work. So
Right.
we thought about how can we make domestic work valued. So how can we value it in terms of what the market would value it. So there are a few ways to do this, and one standard way is called a substitution method with generalist wages. So it's a complicated term to say we're trying to impute what wages these domestic hours would take if they were performed in the market. So how we did that is first we need to understand how many hours of domestic work are being performed each day in Malaysian homes. So to get that estimate, we looked at a KRI time use survey, and we tried to estimate how many people are performing unpaid care and domestic work each day. And we took that and we scaled up to the entire population. So to do that, we looked at census figures on how many people are above 15 years of age and older. So we scaled it up to the total number of hours, the number of people, and then we look at what wages would they receive if they were performing those exact tasks in the market. To do that, we looked at a few different wage proxies. We looked at Indeed.com wages for domestic worker, for example, the housekeeper wage from Salary Expert, and they vary in terms of their, how much they are. We looked at the minimum wage, for example, which is currently 1,500 per month.
That's
so
right.
We looked at a range of different wages, and we took the modal one, the median one, the middle one, and that turns out to be about 1,741 ringgit per month. So we thought about, okay, if all those people were doing all these tasks and they were being paid this much per month.
Fairly compensated, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
How much would that be? So it turns out that's about 379 billion in ringgit terms.
Wow,
Right.
379 billion ringgit. Okay, so basically it's all about not the fact that these would definitely be professionally paid care workers, but this is the value that already potentially exists within the unacknowledged sector, right?
Sure, and we're not saying that this is exactly valued or this is what the value of
understood.
societal value of the unpaid care work that performed in Malaysian homes each day. That's not the exact value, but what we're saying is if it were remunerated in market rates, what would it be? And so in this way, we see this as a sort of a lower bound figure, right? So this is the figure that the market would pay, but societal value, we know that positive externalities from unpaid care work are fairly large, extremely large in fact. So in a true value might be far beyond these figures.
Yeah, exactly. I think you ask any homemaker and 8 hours is not the standard day, right? It literally is from the time your eyes open to the time your head hits the pillow. Okay, that's fascinating. Calvin, I definitely want to ask now, were there any regional or perhaps even global standards that you were benchmarking against in your exploration to develop this cradle-to-grave perspective?
Sure, not specifically for this estimate. We did use standard methods that we've seen done in other countries around the world in valuing this unpaid care and domestic work. Specifically, we looked at the case of Argentina. In the Ministry of Economy in Argentina, we used this exact method to value the unpaid care and domestic work performed in Argentinian homes. And we brought that to Malaysian data and Malaysian context, and we tried to replicate those methods. But in terms of the figures, we see that it is fairly the 379 billion ringgit, and in terms of percentage terms as well, it's fairly standard in terms of how it ranks around amongst the countries in the world.
Right, so pretty standardized as well. And of course, I'm expanding the lens a little wider, but when it comes to statutory long-term care services, which ought to be the ideal that we're working towards, I just want to emphasize that this is not only something which Nordic or Western countries have. Neighboring Brunei and Singapore actually do already have that. All right, so adding on to the discussion, Min Hui, I want to move back into asking you all about the fact that unpaid care work is also primarily, again, viewed only via the lens of childcare. Perhaps if we could move into first a few more inclusive definitions, because childcare is one thing that has become a little bit more prominent, perhaps over the past 2-3 years, but there are so many other dimensions of care work, and those are very invisibilized, very feminized, and perhaps even stigmatized.
Yeah, I think you're right when you say that. I mean, just looking at the situation that Malaysia is in right now, as we age, our old age dependency ratios will only increase, and that also means there will be less family members in the family to help out with care.
Sure.
So you're going to be burdening the informal family unit a lot. We have to look at definitely beyond childcare. Aged care is a huge concern, especially if it intersects with circumstances like disability, living in poverty, living in ill health. All of these things combine to really affect people's social well-being, and this will affect how people age in dignity, whether they live in a quality life or not, whether they live in good health. So a more inclusive conception that we try to do, as I said before, is this cradle-to-grave care economy, which recognizes that these care needs tend to change over time. Based off our estimations, this is important because current care infrastructure, whether formal or informal, it's basically insufficient and inadequate to meet these care needs. And when we say life cycle, it's actually something borrowed from social protection literature. But we do think that it's very, very relevant here to provide social protection, some kind of baseline access to care that all Malaysians can access as they age.
Exactly. And when we speak about these so-called care gaps, the factors which are exacerbating this are not, going anywhere. So what is really essential is to frame the fact that, number one, we don't have the infrastructure, and number two, we can't rely on the nuclear family model the way it is structured right now for it to continue on into the near future. So looking at best practices then, what would be the best way for Malaysia to not just recognize this and talk about it, but look at it very actionably, perhaps even as quickly as the upcoming budget for 2025, which should be tabled very soon?
Sure. I think I do want to clarify one point first, and it's that it's not to say that we can't rely on the informal family unit, but the point is we need to support the family unit. If we are going to continually rely on them, informal caregivers need to be supported. There are a range of things. So you bring up the upcoming budget. I think this is a great conversation to have. In our policy recommendations, what we are really pushing for is major systemic and structural reform. Now, this can't happen without multi-sectoral coordination. The budget must be well aware of that. So some things that we have highlighted in our report, there are 4 main policy directions that we think can be taken. The first is integrating social care into Malaysia's social protection framework. We note that care is missing from the framework. Apparently, what we have right now is very centered on formal employment or on a needs-based basis. But moving forward, we need to try and bridge care services to social protection. We need to be giving informal caregiving allowance, enhancing people's retirement savings so that they will be able to afford care later on in life. We also look a lot at investing in community-based care infrastructure and services. We find that this is a very flexible alternative and more convenient than, let's say, public care services, which have very low coverage, and private care services might be quite expensive. So community-based care services allow people to age in place, be situated in the community with which they feel comfortable in. Moving forward, we also look a lot at establishing policy and governance structures for social care. I think what the government can do is really come in and buffer that enabling environment. Look at the legislative frameworks, look at the gaps currently, address them, look at a National Care Act. How can we formalize Malaysia's commitments to care, and that will be the basis for action moving forward. And finally, really instituting system-wide gender-sensitive and care-centered approaches. We do know that care is a gendered issue, whether we like it or not. women tend to live longer than men, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they live in better health. Most care workers are also women, so we need to ensure that the initiatives that we have in mind are gender sensitive and respond to that reality. I think these are some of the things that the budget can solely consider, but we need to move beyond the budget as well. We also need to look at how ministries can come together and coordinate more smoothly to really think about a cradle-to-grave care economy. It really needs a whole of society approach, really.
Exactly, and I'm drawing on a couple of interesting data points which have recently come out. Number one, the National Health and Mobility Survey. The fresh one is out about a month ago. That's actually showing us that, in fact, Malaysians and our NCD burdens are increasing. So approximately the average Malaysian with the average amount of NCDs is likely going to need to spend at least 9 years of their aged life in care, meaning which they are not going to be able to live independently either. And at the same time, you've also got the Finance Ministry's Economic Outlook 2023 report, which is going in depth and showing the fact that, yes, our standards of living, healthcare, etc., have contributed to a huge increase in the average age and the lifespan that a Malaysian can expect to have. But this also means that now we have the care deficit on the other hand. All right, so all of this is making a lot of sense, but at the same time, it does sound like it is going to be a little bit of a behemoth moving all of this in a timely fashion and manner. However, I think, Min Hui, perhaps you could comment on shifting the paradigm of care as a developmental priority rather than looking at it as an expenditure. Yeah,
that's a really good point. Care has commonly been seen as a welfare issue or an issue of cost.
Right.
And therefore, governments across the world have normally been quite hesitant to invest this much. But as we've seen in a lot of other countries that have aging populations, investing in care is a productive investment. What we try to do with our policy paper is that we try to show that the public investment today will have returns in the future, not just in terms of GDP, but also in terms of less tangible but equally important things like enhanced human capital, better labour productivity, improved social well-being as people age in dignity, potentially less strain on public healthcare systems, and last but not least, for gender equality as well. So we see that looking at care as a developmental priority is needed also because we need to change things on a systemic basis and not really on a piecemeal basis.
Sure.
This is because some of the policy gaps identified are really structural in nature. As I said before, things like the lack of social care and social protection, the heavy reliance on informal caregiving, all of these things combined really undermine the growth of the care economy, and therefore all sectors of the government really need to come together and work on it.
Exactly. I'll particularly pick up on the point you made about social care and the lack of it from the social protection framework, because that essentially means that everyone from lower income families, and in particular the women, will then be disadvantaged across their life cycle, right? Okay, so moving on with the discussion though, before we do that, we take a brief break. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned to Niaga Spotlight. Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight. You're still with me, Tamina Kauschi. And today, of course, on the Future Affairs segment, we're discussing cradle-to-grave care economy as investment for national development. Calvin, so moving into another area of discussion, tell me about the opportunity costs for Malaysia if we actually fail to invest appropriately and in a timely fashion for a cradle-to-grave care economy.
Sure, thanks, Mina. I think when we're talking about opportunity costs, there's two things really to keep in mind, at least from our perspective. One of it, I would say, is the economics of it. And the other is sort of the social and inclusion aspects of the costs. So the first thing, economic costs. So earlier we talked about how unpaid care and domestic work in Malaysia, if valued in GDP terms, would be about 379 billion ringgit
That's right.
per year. Now, we know that due to the way in which we organize the economy, it's not feasible that all of those 379 billion will be valued eventually in GDP, just because capitalism and the way wages are doled out in society, right? So then we think about, okay, what the gains from removing the constraints to work, right? So currently we know from statistics that there are about 3.2 million Malaysians who are remaining outside of the workforce or remaining in part-time work, who want to transition to full-time work, who want to transition into market work, but they are constrained by household duties, care work, and domestic work. And so we thought about how can we bring those 3.2 million people into the workforce, and how much value would that create, right? So in the paper, we present further back of the envelope estimates of the direct effect of potential market gains from fully enabling these 3.2 million workers to participate in paid employment or to go from part-time to full-time, right? And so our direct gain, we estimate, is about 77 billion in economic value per year. And that would add about 4.9 percentage points in GDP terms for 2022 alone. So inaction, or rather not investing in the care economy at this juncture, would leave these large economic potential gains on the table. And the second thing, as I mentioned, is the sort of social inclusion aspects, right? So I think Min Hui alluded to this earlier, but out of those 3.2 million workers who we know are basing their labor supply decisions based on unpaid care and domestic work, out of those 3.2 million Malaysian workers, we know that 98% of them are women, right? So what this means is that investing in the care economy will be hugely impactful for closing the gender gaps in economic outcomes, in work outcomes, in participation, in hours work, on both the intensive and extensive margins. So if we remove all these barriers, hypothetically, for these millions of Malaysians, we would effectively close the gender gap in labour force participation rates. So currently, women's labour force participation rates are about 56%, and I think men's participation rates are about 80-something%. So if we allow these 3.2 million workers, 98% of these workers who are women, to enter the labour force, that would effectively immediately close that gap in participation rates. So we would see parity in the men and women's labour force participation rates. Of course, we're not saying that every person who is currently performing unpaid care and domestic work in the home should work.
That's right. It's still up to them.
Right,
we
exactly.
still want to offer a choice, right?
Precisely. So I think this is the point we wanted to get across, is that it's about restoring choice and freedom. So these are people who specifically said that they were hindered by these constraints. And these are not people who said that they are performing home production and they are fine with it. There's not those people. These are people who specifically said that it's a constraint, that they want to work, but they otherwise cannot, are unable to. So we're talking about from the perspective of restoring freedom of choice for these millions of Malaysians who want to work, right? And we think that if we don't invest in the care economy now, laying the foundations for the care economy, these people would continue to be constrained by, unpaid care work that they are performing at home.
Absolutely. And I think the interesting thing to also very much consider is the fact that Malaysia as a population, we've got a median age that is very young, roughly around 31. So with these factors for informal care work becoming unsustainable in the near future, unless the choice is given, one can presume, even from an economic or a policy angle, that the fall in fertility rates will definitely continue. And at the same time, of course, nothing stops aging. So some really interesting points there. But once again, I think it's important to emphasize on the GDP figure, the 379 billion rough estimate, actually as a tool of persuasion for the policymakers so that they do realize the full gravity of the situation itself. Calvin, also looking at the fact that women do perform the bulk of unpaid caregiving, how does this actually impact women's LFBR? And then we go into GDP as well as national development issues. Min Hui as well, if you've got anything to add to that.
Sure. So I think where we stand now is that, and this is true globally as well, is that there are specific social norms that dictate which person in the household performs home production duties or performs the most hours of unpaid care and domestic work. And we know, at least from in a global sense, that social norms have very significant impacts on labour market outcomes. just generally to speak, right? Particularly for women. So cross-country evidence, especially over the last 2-3 years, shows that countries with stronger patriarchal norms, as measured by surveys asking what they believe the role of women are in the household and so forth, we know that countries with stronger patriarchal norms have larger long-run child penalties for women. So what this means is that when we look at women's earnings, they fall after childbirth. And in countries with stronger patriarchal norms, they tend to fall more than countries with more looser or more egalitarian norms, right? So even in the most gender egalitarian countries, right? So we're talking like Sweden and Denmark, there is still a long-run penalty in a wage sense of about 20% in women's earnings over 20 years post-birth, right? And in other less egalitarian countries, that could be as high as about 60%, for example. So this is all this is to say that social norms have very tangible impacts on real-world, real-life outcomes for many workers, and particularly millions of the Malaysian workers, right? So the second question, I guess, is how exactly does it do that? How exactly does something that is a norm or something more ethereal become tangible in terms of outcomes, right? So I think that there's sort of two ways we could look at it. One of it is the pre-labor market factors. So these are all the factors of workers or people before they enter the labor market. So this is human capital, this is schooling, this is college, it's university, right? So there's a lot of progress on this, at least in a gender sense, over the past 2-3 decades. I'm sure everybody is well aware that gender gaps in education, at least in terms of years, are closing quite rapidly over the past 10 years, even in Malaysia, right? If you look at years of schooling, if you look at university enrollment rates, and so on and so forth. So the second factor is, what about in-labor market factors? So there's something that happens at that transition. There's something that happens in work, right? And we know that one reason is on work intensity and participation, right, as we mentioned before. So women both participate less in the workforce, and when they do, they work less hours than men. And these gaps in work intensity and participation really start small. Like I said, during university education, they start really small, but they really start to widen in the mid-20s, and they really go diverge in the mid-30s, and they never ever close again, right? So this gap in both the extensive and intensive margin is really large and diverging as women age. And the other thing as well is something that some economists call compensating differentials. So this is a complicated term to say that women are just willing to accept lower wages in exchange for more flexibility, in exchange for shorter commutes. And again, we see this only happening especially after childbirth, right? So there's a gender gap in commuting preference that widens, slowly widens more and more after childbirth. And I think current estimates is we think that about 6 to 12% of gender gaps in wages are due to commuting differences. For example, this underscore how large these preferences are. So all of that is just to show you a little bit illustrate how social norms can interact to form real world outcomes, right?
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing those examples, Calvin. I think it's really useful because then we're actually looking at the smaller influencing factors, and also the fact that historically speaking, correlation between women's participation in the labor market and economic development, it generally follows a U-shaped sort of trend. It goes basically, it decreases before increasing again at a later stage. Now, this would be typical for economies that are able to actually invest or allocate towards care infrastructure. Malaysia, though, we've long known that we have sort of like a single camel hump when it comes to women's LFPR. Women get their university degrees, etc., even more so than men, especially over the past 25 years. But the moment they get married, start a family, they drop out. Very few of them come back in, which is why we've got that single camel hump. So all of those factors taken into cognizance. Min Hui, so what would be then the main considerations for Malaysia's cradle-to-grave care economy?
That's a good question. So when we were writing this policy paper, we understood the fact that Malaysia is at a pivotal point in the care economy. It is starting to really think about how it can go about doing it. You know, Prime Minister Anwar spoke about it, and it's part of the Madani economy framework. There's so much momentum moving, but really we have yet to envision an ideal endpoint of where it should go. So with that idealism in mind, we have three basic tenets that we think that Malaysia should aspire to in the future. The first is to approach care as a public good. Now, I say this because a lot of countries go the privatization route. So that means you can only access care if you can afford it, or they will look at other ways of private insurance or things like that. But that is really dependent on your socio-economic circumstances. But what we do know is that care is a human right. Everyone deserves the right to care and be cared for. And I think Malaysia can gradually move towards that ideal endpoint where care is not a luxury. It is something that everyone will be able to afford. I think this will do wonders for our social well-being in the future. It will do wonders for Malaysia's development and economic growth as well. So in order to be able to approach care as a public good, we also have to rethink how we have looked at our welfare state. We've normally gone the residual route, really taking more of a regulatory role, less of a direct service provider. But moving forward, what the government can consider is thinking of the enabling framework, putting in all the legislative frameworks, the social protection schemes, and think about really making that as comprehensive as possible. Now, the second tenet that we were thinking of is alluding back to the title of this report, which is Cradle-to-Grave care economy. And I think that's self-explanatory by now. And the final is really that Malaysians should all be able to access a baseline of care. In certain countries, the low income really are given a lot of support to be able to afford that. I think moving forward, we do need to focus our efforts on the most impoverished of our society, looking at how, because care services, whether they have it or not, could really be the matter of life or death for them. And we want to ensure that they have the benefit of choice. Moving forward, I think this is the ideal endpoint for Malaysia. The time to build up those structures to get to that is now.
Time is definitely now. And when it comes in particular to be able to afford care as a social good, there also needs to be the professionalization of the care force for immediate times as well as for the short term to long term. Any thoughts about legislative gaps in this arena in particular, which should actually be taken on right now rather than waiting for 3 to 5 years to see where the private sector is going to go with investments before waiting for it?
Right. Well, I think the care economy now, one of the barriers is that the legislation is really fragmented across various acts, policies and ministries. So moving forward, we do need to bring them all together. Let's say for the example of aged care, we have acts on regulating care centres, and it's shared between the Women's Ministry and the Health Ministry. The same is said for our policies on older persons, things like that. So moving forward, we need that kind of multi-sectoral coordination, as I said before. And actually, you did point out the gap in our legislations already, and that is professionalizing social care workers. That is something that is missing currently, but I do note that the government, especially the Women's Ministry, is working on that front to sort of streamline qualifications for care workers. One of the issues that is faced is that when it comes to childcare, there are some minimum qualifications you have to meet. There is a training that you have to do. But when it comes to aged care and beyond, there really is no training whatsoever, and it's up to private care providers to really decide, okay, maybe you can get 2 to 3 weeks of training. Some people would say 6 months. So then when we talk about quality care, this is a major barrier to that. You cannot ensure quality if that training is not standardized or streamlined. So moving forward, I do believe this professionalization of care workers is a gap, but it is being looked at. But beyond just streamlining qualifications, we also need to look at the conditions of work for social care workers. It is not an easy job. It is back-breaking work, it is long hours, and a lot of them are women as well. So we need to consider how we can protect social care workers. Where could there be options for career development? Could there be options for them to increase their wages to make it a worthwhile vocation? At the end of the day, we are having a labour shortage in the care industry. It is really difficult to find workers. So all of these things will be important to attract the labor supply as well.
Exactly, and I'm also thinking about the fact that if we want to professionalize the labor supply, it cannot be something which is also forced upon those from perhaps, especially women from lower income families, to take it on at absolute dirt rates. So what we're looking at is professionalizing, upskilling, and at the same time, in a sense, also future-proofing this, especially because considering who is going to be able to afford care. So ideally speaking, would we be looking towards a model somewhat like Singapore's, where it is guaranteed for everyone who's aged, regardless of socioeconomic background?
Well, I think, you know, a best practice is to ensure a care infrastructure and services that is being used by all socioeconomic classes. That is how we maintain quality. I mean, I do think there are issues with we only provide services and we just for the low income. What happens is that you know, those services tend to be can run the risk of being underinvested in, and that affects the quality of service that they get, and that affects the quality of their social well-being, the quality of their life. So ideally, the really ideal endpoint is for us to move towards care infrastructure and services that everyone will be able to access. Some people would say that, you know, this much of public investment or involvement would crowd out the private sector. I don't believe that. There will still be people who want to pay for specialized services.
Fair.
There is a wide range of services out there and needs that only private care sector will be able to fill the gaps in. But the idea is to have a baseline quality service that people of all socioeconomic classes will be able to afford. But where we are right now in Malaysia, it is more pragmatic to look at the low-income classes to ensure that, you know, they are not, we don't widen inequalities any further and really try to buffer that for the future.
Absolutely, and I'm seeing a lot of resonance with some of the direction that the government of the day is already taking, for example, with the targeted fuel subsidies. Perhaps we also need to think about targeted social care protection for elderly care in particular, and even childcare. Right.
Yeah,
Lots to think about. Thank you so much, Calvin and Min Hui. It's been a really good discussion. I could go on, but we've come to the end of the time. Well, that's all we have time for today on Niaga Spotlight. Thank you so much for joining us. We will, of course, be on air again next Friday. Till then, have a productive week ahead.